Welcome back to another wellness webinar. If this is not your first time, if it is though, regardless, welcome. So this is Fitness Mythbusters. This is a presentation, or I guess a series of presentations that I've done quite a few of. I think this is the third one this semester. We've done a few over the past couple of years, but this has always been a really popular topic. It's really fun. It's something that I love and enjoy talking about. So I'm really looking forward to what we got covered today. But basically, if you haven't tuned in to Fitness Mythbusters before, we basically treat this a lot like the show Mythbusters. If you've ever seen it, I think they still show some reruns. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to bring up different common beliefs or myths, and then we're going to get to the science behind it and figure out whether or not that's actually true. I've picked some new ones today that I'm pretty excited to talk about, and also bringing some old ones we've discussed in the past. So it's going to be a combination of some different things, but I'm really excited to get started on this. But before we dive right in, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Charles Burroughs, and I'm the Fitness Services Coordinator over for University Recreation here at UA. So I've been here for a little bit over 5 years now. And I currently manage and run the personal training services that we have at the rec center. I also train myself, and then with a few clients, and then also work on several different programs that we have, such as personal trainer prep course. All that stuff is called Tide Strong. I'll talk about that later. But this is something that I love doing and I'm passionate about. This is definitely my bread and butter. I've been working in fitness for about a decade now. And kind of had a chance to work in all different parts of fitness, commercial fitness, corporate wellness, and then obviously here at the university. So let's go ahead and dive right in now that you know a little bit about me. And one thing I want to say first off is that if at any point you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or on the Q&A. I like to make sure to leave a lot of room in these presentations to discuss things and talk about and answer questions. If it's directly related to what I have on screen, I'll address it right then. If I don't, I'll definitely get to it by the end of the presentation. So if I don't answer you right away, it's not because I didn't see it, I don't think. But I'm going to do a good job of keeping an eye on this stuff. So, all right, let's dive right in with our first myth, or not myth. So saying number one. Your muscles turn to fat if you stop working out. I think I first heard this probably, I don't know, when I was like a preteen. It was probably 15, almost 20 years ago. And I was told that if you start working out and you put muscle on, the worst thing that you can possibly do is to stop. Because if you stop, then that muscle will get replaced with fat. It's a very commonly held belief. And basically it can almost make lifting weights a little bit scary. You know, I think the last thing that most of us want is to have excess fat on our bodies. And so the idea of putting on muscle, stopping, and then turning to fat can be a little bit scary. So let's dive into this. And I think that the best way to do this is to get a good understanding of muscles and then also a good understanding of fat. So the two different factors in here, we really need to know what's going on with both in order to answer this one effectively. So let's talk about muscles 101. So first off, the life cycle of a muscle. And don't worry, I'm not going to get too crazy here, but this stuff is important in order to address this question. And really the life cycle of a muscle, there are three parts to it. First one is the hypertrophy stage, the stage where we actually make or build muscle. This is a process that our body starts undergoing basically from birth all the way until we die. And I actually want to point that out because a lot of people don't realize that you can gain muscle, you can build muscle at any point in your life. We've seen studies of participants 75, 80 years old still grow muscle even at an older age. So, you know, we might not be able to become bodybuilders later in life, but we can definitely still build muscle. It's always possible as long as we're living. But in order to build muscle, it requires three important things. First off is we have to have a demand placed on our body for that muscle. And that really comes from training. You know, a lot of times we think of it as resistance training, weight training, right? Lifting weights in the gym. But I think it's important to understand that really it's more about the general demand. right? If my daily life, if my job requires to have some strength, right? If I'm a farmer and I've got to spend a lot of time carrying hay bales and farm equipment around, then I'm putting a demand on my body that says, hey, in order to deal with this weight, with this stress, I need to adapt and become stronger and build muscle. So that's the first and most important thing. We cannot build muscle unless we have a demand for it. We can do everything else, but if we don't do that, it's not going to happen. So that's the first and most important thing is training. Then the other two things are also really important. One is we need to have a caloric surplus, meaning whatever amount of calories that we burn throughout the day, we need to have more than that to add tissue to our body, to build on muscle. If we don't have a caloric surplus, then we are just not going to be able to add any significant amount of tissue to our body, much less muscle. And then also we need protein. As I'm sure we've all heard before, protein is important for our muscles and for building muscles. So we do need to have an adequate amount of protein. Now that exact number can get a little confusing and convoluted depending on who you talk to. One thing I'll say is that our bodies are actually pretty resourceful and good at creating proteins from different processes in our body. It's still important to get it through our diet, but we don't necessarily need to feel like we need to eat, 5 pounds of chicken every day in order to build muscle. All right, but that's a topic for another day. So those are the 3 things that we need to build muscle. Then we have the maintenance stage of muscle, which is really just if we do something to build muscle and we just continue doing that exact thing, right? So let's say 6 months ago, for the first time, I started doing resistance training. And so I did some push-ups, some squats, maybe some pull-ups, and I just did that. And when I started, I met all those 3 criteria and I gained a certain amount of muscle. But I didn't change the program. I did the same thing. I ate the same. Then what would happen is my body would eventually hit a plateau and we would just be in a maintenance stage. I wouldn't lose any muscle because I'm still placing that demand. I'm still getting enough intake calorically to maintain those tissues. And so I would just basically maintain where I'm at. And then the last stage of the life cycle of muscle is atrophy. And that is where we actually see muscles break down. But why does this happen? Why does our body just decide to break down muscle, right? That can seem kind of inconvenient when we put all this work into putting muscle on. It can be frustrating to lose that. But there are reasons. And the most important reason that this happens is that the demand suddenly disappears, right? If I train for 5 years and I built all this muscle and then I just stop, my body is going to recognize that. It's going to recognize that the demand for these muscles to be this strong, to exist, starts to decrease. The good news is we never completely lose our muscle, right? Because we deal with gravity every day. We've got to move. So those muscles aren't just going to disappear, but they aren't going to be as big. They're going to shrink down to match the amount of calories we're bringing in and the amount of work that we need to be done. So, when I mentioned lifestyle, like being a farmer, if I continue to be a farmer my whole life, then I would probably maintain a lot of that muscle for most of my life. As I get older, of course, some things can start to atrophy a little bit. But by and large, if that demand is there, our body will do its best to continue to meet it. But if suddenly after 30 years of being a farmer, I switch to a 8-hour desk job, then my body's going to start to quickly adapt to that by getting rid of that excess muscle that's no longer needed. And so if I wanted to keep it, I would need to implement some sort of strategy or resistance program to maintain that muscle. And that is by far the most important thing to prevent atrophy, is to continue to place that demand on our muscles, to continue to do that. I just saw an interesting question here from George. He says, how quickly can one reach the atrophy stage? Does it happen within a few days or longer? So that's a good question. I would say that the exact number of time is really hard to put an exact number on because all of our bodies are different, our hormone levels are different. But what I will say is, generally speaking, after about 2 weeks, that's when we can start to, I say, see. We probably won't see it, but that is likely when our body is going to start atrophying some. Now it's going to depend on what we're doing, right? If I built up big leg muscles from lots of leg exercises, then that muscle is not going to atrophy as quicker as, say, like my shoulders, because I walk a lot and I use my legs a lot. So the less that you use that muscle, the quicker it's going to atrophy. I think the general rule of thumb is usually at about 2 weeks, we start seeing decreases in strength. That muscle can start to atrophy a little bit. It's not going to be particularly noticeable, though. It takes a lot of time before we really notice a big difference. I would say multiple months, sometimes as much as 3 or 6 months. Again, it just kind of depends. You know what? I used to work with one trainer who extremely muscular, and then he tore his labrum in his shoulder, and he couldn't use that muscle at all. And it was completely immobilized. You know, he had it wrapped up, and because he completely just stopped using it, he saw atrophy really fast, a lot faster than someone who maybe just stopped working out because he completely stopped using that muscle. So that's a good question. It really depends on how much you stop. If it's just a matter of going from working out to not, you probably won't see anything significant happen until you probably hit a couple months. I would say 2-3 months or more. So that is a good question. One thing I'll quickly point out is that once you do experience atrophy, it is a lot easier to rebuild that muscle because your body stores some of the genetic information on those muscles. We have these little structures in our muscles that basically maintain the genetic criteria to rebuild that muscle. So the hardest part of gaining muscle is doing it the first time. If you've done it before, getting back to that is a lot easier than getting there for the first time, if that makes sense. But we won't stray too far there. Great question. And one thing to note is that the reason our body is breaking down this muscle is the demand's not there, right? But also because our body is really good at allocating and reallocating resources, right? It's like that budget at work where, oh, we got to cut costs here and move it over here. We only have so much energy to work with. And so our body is really, really smart about utilizing energy efficiently. So if we've got these tissues here, especially muscle that's not being used enough, then it's going to say, all right, well, let's adapt to what we do need and break down the rest of it for other things. So muscle is typically broken down into proteins and amino acids, which then can be used for a lot of other stuff, for energy, for protein synthesis, for nutrient transport, a lot of other stuff. But it doesn't just disappear. It is getting used for other processes in the body. Now let's talk a little bit about fat. That's the other component here that we need to have a good understanding of. Now, a lot of you probably already know this, but fat is energy storage. When our bodies recognize that we're taking in more calories than we can actually use, then our body stores that. This goes back to that theme of our body just being really efficient. If we're taking in a lot of calories and our body says, okay, I'm going to use this much for this activity, this much for that, use this to regrow hair and nails and all that stuff, and we still have a surplus, our body's smart and says, well, let's not let this go to waste. We're going to store it. We're going to store it in our fat cells. Fun fact about fat cells, actually, not to get off too much of a tangent, but we actually only have a set number of fat cells. After we hit puberty, the number of fat cells in our body actually doesn't change. The only thing that changes is how big those fat cells get. So if we put on quite a bit extra weight, those cells inflate and have more fat in them to be used for energy, but the actual number of cells doesn't change. Just thought that was interesting. But anyways, so our body recognizes excess calories and it converts it into fat to be used later. So if we think about it, if we have, a decent amount of excess fat, then we're just a really great storage facility, right? Our body is good at keeping that. We might not like it, but it's just a kind of a unique way of looking at that, right? And then when we need that fat, our body looks to it and uses it for energy. Now, our body is always using some of that fat, but it's really not super noticeable unless we go into a caloric deficit. Once we go into a caloric deficit, our body is starting to look for other places to get more energy. So if I need 2,000 calories a day and I'm only eating 1,700, my body is going to try to figure out where to get that other 300 calories. I think it's 70, yeah, 300 calories. And so that's an important part of this, is if we want to use that stored fat, then we've got to be in a bit of a caloric deficit. And one other thing I'll point out is that fat is really primarily burned in low intensity activities. So, going for a run, that's great. There's a lot of benefits, and it can ultimately end up in more calories burned, but that activity is not actually burning fat. It's going to be mostly burning carbs, and then our body will use fat later. But fat is mostly used for very low intensity activities because it takes a while to break down. It's just not as efficient, but that's okay. All right, so that's the basics of fat. So let's talk about muscles as it relates to fat. Muscle and fat have completely different makeup, different structures. This isn't anatomy and physiology. I'm not going to bore you with slides of cells, although I think that'd be fun. But I know that probably would be interesting for you. But they're completely different. The way that they're created is different, right? We talked about that. Our body makes fat by taking excess nutrients, primarily in the form of extra carbs, but also other nutrients can as well, and then converts that into fat. When our body breaks down muscle, it breaks it down to amino acids, which is not going to be created or transformed into fat. So dissolved muscle will be used to facilitate other processes. It is not going to just sit there. Our body's not going to break down a tissue just to do that. Again, it's a reallocation of resources. And then lastly, well, we already talked about fat accumulation. So I think you can see where I'm getting at this point, but will your muscles turn into fat? No, they're not going to. And with that being said, though, I will often hear this question. I think it's worth addressing, and that's, if my muscles aren't turning into fat, then what's going on? Why is it that I stopped working out? I didn't necessarily gain a lot of weight, but it looks like I have more fat in my body. Why did that happen? And there can be a few reasons that might explain that. First one is that muscle provides a lot of shape to our body. And it provides shape, and it also spreads out and creates more surface area for the fat we do have on our body. So that's why someone that might be, 18, 20% fat can still look muscular, because they build that muscle and then the muscle spreads out the fat and it sort of just pushes it out, and that fat just becomes a nice little small cushion. But muscle provides that extra surface area, and as a result spreads fat out more. So that can be one reason. Another one is also that if we lose muscle, we are also losing some of our metabolism. In other words, the amount of calories we're going to burn every day is going to decrease. And that's not just calories in a workout, not just at rest, but also in our workouts. Muscle needs calories in order to just survive. And then it also needs more calories to actually work and process. If I have bigger leg muscles, then even when I'm walking, that's going to require more energy because there's more tissue there. And so it's going to need more calories to operate and to run. Now, in some extreme cases, significant muscle loss or fat loss as well can also result in loose skin, which might be why it seems as though you might have more fat in your body. I will say for the most part, though, that's not as common unless it's more of an extreme case. And most of the time, our body can be pretty good at shrinking some of that skin. It really just depends. I get that question a lot, which is why I bring it up. But a lot of it kind of just depends. But for the most part, I would say the biggest reason that we might feel like maybe we've gained fat when we lose muscle is because we're losing the shape that comes from muscle. Pretty much everyone can gain 5 to 10 pounds of muscle, and they're not going to look big or bulky, and there might not even be a huge difference. But what it is going to do is it's going to provide more surface area and spread out the fat in our body just a little bit more. So our first saying, your muscles turn to fat if you stop working out. Probably guess at this point, myth busted. That is actually not true. The processes of gaining fat is completely different from losing muscle, and there's no carryover there. They're completely separate. Any questions about that one before we move forward? Our next one is going to be a little bit similar. We're going to talk more about muscles and fat. I don't see any questions, so we're going to keep going. Okay, so this next one says that if you're wanting to lose weight, if that's your goal, then you need to avoid lifting weights, right? I'm sure a lot of you have heard that before. I know I absolutely have. I've even have clients come and sit down for me for the first time, and they say, well, I want to lose this much weight. I say, okay, we're going to do some resistance training. They're like, no, I don't want to do that. All we ever hear is that if we want to lose weight, then we shouldn't do resistance training, or that can be detrimental or it can slow down. Real quick before I go on, I do see a question. And it says, should you focus on your exercise by raising your metabolism, building muscle, or both? So the thing is that when we build muscle, we are raising our metabolism. I would recommend, and we'll kind of get to that more here in a bit, but I would recommend trying to build a little bit of muscle for any goal. And actually, I'm going to stop there because I don't want to give away the ending here. But I think I'll answer that more here in just a second. So we'll keep moving. So commonly said, avoid resistance training. Or a lot of times it might just be, well, my goal is weight loss. So why do I need to do resistance training, right? So to understand this one, we got two things to talk about. We talk about the basics of weight loss, and then also talk about how resistance training plays a role for any goal. So first off, the basics of weight loss. And this is something that I've presented on a lot, and I know there are other presentations that commonly talk about weight loss. So I don't want to dive too deep here, but just to kind of establish this baseline, make sure we're all on the same page. To lose fat, the most important factor here is we've got to eat less calories than we're burning. All the other things that we hear about and that we talk about, hormones or genetics or all these other things, that is a distant second to this basic principle that if we want to burn fat, we have got to burn it by eating less than we're burning. That is the most important step here. So I assume a lot of you already know this, but we've got to establish that before we can talk about anything else, because it's really important. Now, how is that done? So this is just a very basic equation, right? If calories in minus calories burned, if that's positive, then we're in a caloric surplus, right? If it's zero, then we're right at maintenance. And if it's negative, that means that we're burning stored calories. We're having to find it somewhere else. So the way that we do this then is we just manipulate the variables in that equation, right? So if we want to create a deficit, then we can simply lower caloric intake, right? Eating less calories than we were to maintain. Or we can increase the calories burned. Now that might seem fairly obvious, but I want to point that out because, a lot of times when our goal is weight loss or even gaining muscle, whatever, we tend to focus on just one of those, right? We say, well, if my goal is weight loss, then I'm just going to change the way I eat. Or if my goal is weight loss, I'm just going to work out and not change anything about the way I eat. But if you think about it, what makes the most sense is it's going to guarantee that we manipulate that equation correctly is if we do both. If we focus on decreasing our calories and also focus on increasing our calories burned. Now, we're not going to dive into specific numbers and all that today, but just know that that is the absolute basics of weight loss. And we've got to get this part right. And what that means is if we're not seeing as much weight loss as we think or as we hope, then that means that there's something wrong in that equation that we've got to figure out. All of our bodies are not the same. And while you may have got online and found a calculator that said, oh, you burn this many calories, that might be basically true, but it not be completely accurate to your body. And the activities, the things that you did that day can always adjust that number. So the safest thing to do is try to address both. We want to create a caloric deficit, but we also want to burn more. All right. Someone said, can I address all the questions? Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. All right. One person asked, can we answer all of our questions you are asking here? If it's related to this, yes, I'm going to save some time at the end as well to answer some more off the wall questions. And then if we run out of the time, my contact info will be there. And you can always send me questions that way as well. I love answering this stuff, so I'm more than happy to. Absolutely. Okay. So that's the basics of weight loss, right? We need a caloric deficit. Now, how does resistance training play a role here? There's a lot of benefits to resistance training. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I do want to touch on a few of them and remind us that lifting weights is not really just about strength and building muscle. That's usually what we think of and what we associate with. But resistance training is more than that. And if you don't take away anything else from this, I ask that you really consider adding resistance training to whatever program you're doing or going to start, because resistance training has a lot of specific benefits to just it that you're not going to get from cardio or from stretching. Resistance training has its own large set of benefits. So yes, we do see increased strength when we do resistance training. Yes, we also actually see an improved body coordination. Our nerves get more efficient. Our body, we're able to control it better when we're regularly doing resistance training. We see stronger bones, tendons, and ligaments. Basically, all the structures around our joints become stronger. And then, yes, we can see muscle growth. But I put a little star there because it's important to point out, you know, in the last saying, we talked about how those three factors all need to be working in order for us to gain muscle. We need to be placing enough demand, but we also need to get the eating right. And so if I'm doing resistance training, but I'm eating in a caloric deficit, which is our goal for weight loss, then it's going to be actually really hard to build muscle. Our body is not going to prioritize building muscle when there's a caloric deficit. It just doesn't make sense for our body. It needs those calories elsewhere. Now, what is going to be essential and what is important is that if we are doing resistance training, then we are causing micro damages to our muscles. That's how we improve and how we repair. And as a result, our body is going to prioritize that muscle to, if nothing else, repair it back to where it was. So regardless if we're in a deficit or not, our body is going to want to make sure that those muscle fibers get repaired. And that's really important when we're talking about weight loss. So let's talk about some cold hard facts about all this put together. Significant muscle growth requires the right conditions in order to build muscle. You might often hear that there are newbie gains for people who just start with resistance training where it's a little bit easier to gain muscle and get stronger. That's absolutely true. But there is a cap on that, and it's pretty soon. Most people are going to see some pretty quick progress and build a little bit of muscle as long as they're not in an extreme deficit. But that ends pretty quickly. And then after about 6 months, you really need a pretty significant caloric overage in order to start to build muscle. If we aren't having extra calories to devote to that, our body is just not going to prioritize it. Another important thing to point out is that lifting weights does increase total calories burned. Now we might say, oh, that's with any exercise, and you are right. But when we do resistance training, not only is that happen during the exercise, but it's also having to happen afterwards, because then our body is focused on recovery and using nutrients in order to repair those muscles. And I think one of the most important aspects here that often gets overlooked is that resistance training prioritizes our muscles. And that's important because, going back to that example of it's almost like a business, like a budgetary meeting, right? If we are doing resistance training when it comes time for cuts, then you've got someone saying, hey, we're not touching the muscle here. It's important. We need this. Our body is going to prioritize that because that demand is being put on it. So resistance training is an important part of weight loss because it's telling our body that our muscles need to be repaired and need to be focused on. And as long as we're not in a really extreme deficit, our body is going to continue to repair those muscles appropriately and keep them important, which means that we're not going to, or we're less likely to, lose muscle when we are trying to cut fat and lose fat. So, question: avoid resistance trainings if your goal is weight loss? Absolutely myth busted. And quite the opposite is true. Lifting weights can really aid in losing fat. The gym I used to work at for my very first job out of college, I remember the owner was obsessed with this idea, and he always did it with his clients, and it generally did work. And that was that anytime you'd have a client come in that really wanted to lose some weight, and they didn't have a lot of muscle, they were new to resistance training, they hadn't done it before, then one thing that he would do with them is he would ask them to first focus on building muscle. That for the first 6 months or 3 to 6 months, yes, your goal is weight loss, that's great. But if your goal is to lose weight, then we want to actually start with building just a little bit of muscle. And so that might not necessarily mean eating on a caloric surplus, but it might mean purposely eating closer to what we're actually burning or what we think we're burning, and then letting our body use those newbie gains to build a little muscle first. So, if this is your first time starting and your ultimate goal is to lose weight, you could actually do a little bit of caloric surplus, do some resistance training. What our body will do is it'll prioritize building some muscle. And then once we built a little bit of muscle, our metabolism is going to be faster. It's going to be more efficient. And then it's going to make it easier to burn fat. I've noticed that clients who have really struggled with yo-yo dieting, or if they have done some really extreme caloric deficits in the past, that can slow their metabolism down. It can make it a lot harder to lose weight. And one thing that we can kind of mix it up and refresh our body is to actually focus on building a little bit muscle first, and then shift our focus back into weight loss. And not only is that good just physiologically in our body, but I think that's also really healthy mentally. A lot of times we can really stress about weight loss and become hyper-focused and obsessed on it. And that's definitely not healthy for our own mental health. So having a little break to focus on something different, I've also found is really effective for some clients, is to just shift our focus for a little bit. Rather than just getting burnt out, spinning our wheels, trying really hard to force something. Maybe we need to improve our metabolism, and that's going to make it easier. So just a thought there to add at the end. All right, I'm going to check for questions real quick. I think we're good. All right, we'll head on to the next one. Okay. There we go. All right, so the next one, we're going to shift away from muscles and from fat. We're going to talk a little bit about running. This one is crazy common. I hear this a lot, even from fitness professionals. It's talked about a lot. And that is that running on asphalt or other hard surfaces is bad for your knees. Gets talked about a lot, right? So does this happen? Does running damage your joints? Can it cause a lot of health issues both now and down the road? So I think to address this appropriately, let's first talk a little bit about just running injuries in general. The other topics are something I spend so much time on that I can pretty quickly talk about. While I've definitely done my share of 5Ks and stuff like that in the past, I am not a running fanatic by any means. So when addressing this one, I wanted to go back and do some of my own research on this again and kind of refresh on some stuff. And I found some pretty interesting stuff. First off, I never knew that 80% of running injuries are from repetitive stress. That's straight from the National Institute of Health. 80%. So by and large, most of the injuries and the problems that we have from running comes from repetitive stress. And that makes a lot of sense because running does put a lot of stress on our body because we're dealing with gravity, right? And the more weight that we have on our body, the more stress that's going to be, regardless if that's just because our body is bigger or if we have excess weight, whatever it is. But running does put a lot of stress on our body. And I would argue it is one of the most stressful forms of cardio that we can do because we're so directly defying gravity. It's not like swimming in a pool or riding a bike or doing a row machine. We are upright where gravity is at its harshest. And then we are running on just two legs. So putting a lot of force on those joints. So running does put a lot of stress on our lower body. And so it does, I guess, kind of make sense that most of these injuries are just from repetitive stress. It's not from rolling ankles and tears and all that kind of stuff. It's primarily from slow, gradual things that build up. And so just a quick tip here, we'll talk about more, is that running in particular, you really need to listen to your body on that. If you start to experience aches and pains, that's a sign that maybe you need more rest or you need to stop what you're doing and fix something. Because these injuries come on really slowly. And the worst thing we can do is just avoid it until it becomes a big problem. And I know a lot of us can tend to do that. I know I've been guilty of that. But if we start to experience some issues, we need to try to start problem solving. But anyways, we'll move on. So running puts a lot of stress on our body. And so that increases the importance of three really big things that can affect our ability to run safely. The first one is going to be steady progression, followed by proper footwear, and then also good form. Now, for most of these, I have a separate slide to talk about, except for the steady progression, because I think that one is pretty straightforward. What I mean by steady progression is that we aren't trying to start off too fast and progress too fast. You know, if you used to run a whole lot, right? Like maybe you ran 4 or 5 miles a day, and then you took a 10-year break or a 5-year break, then the worst thing you can do is go out there and just try to run 5 miles like you used to, because your body spent a long time adapting to that. And then when you stopped, your body stopped adapting to it as well. So coming back to that can be jarring for the body. So steady progression is really important. And it's really hard to say the exact method of progression. I think you'll find that if you look up different running programs that exist out there, they're going to give you a good idea of what progression looks like. But one thing I want to say is that you don't want to start off trying to do too much too fast. That is definitely a recipe for an injury. If not your first day, it might be that first week or that first month where you'll start to experience some issues. So steady progression is really important in really all aspects of fitness, but definitely with running, because our body's got to adapt. The second thing is proper footwear. So we're going to dive into that one just a little bit more. Running shoes can be a topic people talk about for ages and ages, and people get heated on this topic. So I'm going to keep it very simple and very basic. There are tons of great running shoes out there. You can spend $50, you can spend $600. There's lots of options. But one thing you're going to find is that typically running shoes are going to have several common characteristics that you'll see pretty much throughout. The first one is going to be shock absorption. Cushion, basically. You'll notice every shoe in this picture has a pretty thick cushion, right? It's not like a flip-flop or a sandal or even a boot. There's quite a bit of cushion, and it's spread out pretty evenly there. That is especially important if we're running on something that's hard. If we're dealing with a lot of force, think of shock absorption as a way of lessening the stress or the impact of dealing with a hard surface. So cushion is very common in most running shoes. I think it was probably like 10 or 12 years ago, there was this huge movement towards like barefoot running, or like running in like those Vibram 5-finger shoes that are just like very minimalistic, almost like beach shoes, but they fit around your toes. There's a big movement towards that. The only issue with that is if you try to run barefoot on asphalt or something hard, you are putting a ton of stress on your joints, like a whole lot, a lot more than if you have some sort of cushion. And while it's true that barefoot running is going to really work on increasing the strength and durability of your feet, I really don't recommend running with minimal padding on a hard surface. I don't recommend that. So that's going to be a common thing you see pretty much on all running shoes. Breathable fabric is also going to be really common, just so your feet don't sweat too much. And also they're going to be durable. And you'll often find that the more you spend on a running shoe, a lot of times the more durable they are. Or if they're not necessarily more durable, but the way they wear down is going to be a little bit more safer. They're a lot less likely to blow out on you. So if you're interested in running or you do a lot of running, it is really important that you invest in a good shoe, because it's going to last longer. It's going to help absorb a lot of the force that comes from running, and it's usually going to last a long time. Now, form. So this is the third one. I apologize for the potato quality picture here. I spent a lot of time trying to find a good picture to illustrate this, and it's actually really hard. In fact, if you search good running form on Google, it's like a war out there. People have tons of different opinions on, should I strike with my heel first? Should I strike with my toe or the ball of my foot? Should I have my arms here or whatever? We're not going to do a running workshop today. We're not going to talk about all the specifics, but there's really one important concept that gets completely overlooked and is really the main reason that we can hurt ourselves when are running. If it's due to form and we hurt ourselves, it is likely because of where our foot actually strikes. So you'll notice on the left, That figure is striking way out in front of them. This will feel really natural for someone who's just starting running, or if they're running really slow, like more like a jog. What will often happen is they'll reach really forward with their foot to strike the ground. And that's because when we walk, that's how our body typically does it. Because when we're walking, each foot is almost always in contact with the ground, or at least there's a good portion where both feet are. And because of that, our weight is distributed equally between both legs until it swings forward. When it comes to running, though, there's no point where both feet are touching the ground. And because of that, it's important that our feet stay stacked in line with our body. Now you'll notice this guy in this picture here is he's leaning slightly forward, which is also good for him. But you'll notice that his foot is striking pretty much in line with the rest of his joints in our body. And that's important because that way we're evenly distributing the force throughout our body, rather than putting a ton of force in just our ankle or our knee or even our hip there. You can see just by looking at it how there might be issues in each of those three joints when it's separated from the body and then force is hitting it. The most important thing is where our foot strikes. And I think this is a really helpful tip if you're just getting into running, or maybe you're trying to work on something, because I've noticed in the past that when someone first gets started, they can get really overwhelmed with this stuff because there are entire websites and forums based on running form, and it just becomes this thing you start to think way too much about. The most important and primal thing that you got to do is you want to try to keep your body stacked and land your feet beneath your body. If you're not doing that, that is probably going to be a big cause for these stress-related injuries that develop over time. Things like shin splints and runner's knee, issues in your hip flexors. A lot of that comes from where your foot is striking. Yeah, so that's actually a big one and one that often gets overlooked. So what about terrain, right? We talked about shoes, we talked about progression, we talked about form. All those things are extremely important. But you notice that I didn't bring up terrain at all. And there's a reason for that. So it's actually interesting. There's a pretty good amount of research on running on different types of terrain. Now, obviously, injuries can happen from running on really wild surfaces just because of like freak injuries, right? Like strains, rolled ankles, for running on rocks and stuff like that, that definitely can increase risk of injury. But if we take that part of the equation out and it's just a matter of how hard or soft the surface is, well, we see one that yes, there is more force from running on a hard surface. That's absolutely true. And I guess that's just physics, right? It's reactive forces. You hit the ground hits back. And because it's not soft, none of that force is dissipating. So running on a hard surface does cause more force to be distributed throughout your body. However, there's actually no evidence to support that running on asphalt causes more injuries than any other kind of surface. And when I first heard that, I was actually pretty shocked. This is something I've been told for years and years, is that running on asphalt is horrible for your joints. But there's actually no evidence out there to support that. In fact, there are a few different studies, and one in particular, this one was in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. They actually talked about how running on asphalt was less likely to cause an injury, and that the participants doing it experienced less, repetitive stress issues than running on sand. In fact, sand was actually not a great surface to run on in terms of getting all kinds of tendon issues and aches and pains. And I think part of that is just the unpredictability of a surface that's so soft. So actually, running on a stable, hard surface like asphalt can be safer than running on something extremely unsafe. But, of course, there's got to be a but, right? But there are a few important things to consider here. The harder force that comes from running on asphalt or any hard surface, it makes it a bit more, we'll say, risky on our bodies. That harder force is going to more likely expose issues that we are having. So if we do have poor form, if maybe we have some sort of muscle dysfunction, something that's not working properly, those issues are more likely to become a problem and are going to quickly become a problem if we're running on a hard surface. And I think that is where this myth comes from, is the simple fact that there is little less room for error when we're running on a hard surface. And like I mentioned, you want to have a more cushion when we're running on a hard surface. So individuals who are running just like barefoot on asphalt, yeah, you're probably more likely to experience issues because your form has really got to be spot on. Now, one thing that I'll say though is that the nice thing about having that increase in hard forces is that it's almost like resistance training. The more weight or the more force we put on our body within reason, our body's going to adapt to that. So by running on a hard surface, if we're progressing nice and slowly, if we're using good form, and if we've got the right kind of footwear, our body's going to adapt to that favorably. Our joints are going to become stronger and more adaptive to those kinds of forces and that stress. So in a lot of ways, running on asphalt can be beneficial. But there are other things that are important. Rest becomes really even more important than ever. Those more forces are going to cause more small damages to our tissues, like our muscles. And as a result, we need a little bit more rest. You can think about it as like, if I go into the gym and do 2 hours of chest exercises, I'm probably going to need more rest to recover than if I just did 3 or 4. So rest becomes really important when we're putting more stress on our body and running on asphalt. And lastly, and this is probably one of the most important ones, is that new runners are more likely to experience issues with hard surfaces. And it really just comes down to not really addressing those other 3 things correctly. So they either jump into it too quickly, right? You want to start training for a 5K. So you try to go out and instantly run 2 miles. Maybe that is too much on asphalt for your first time because your joints haven't adapted to it. They haven't got stronger. Your body hasn't gotten used to that form. So maybe your form isn't as good. And then you may have not just got the right shoes. But regardless of the exact reason, I see time and time again that new runners are the ones who often experience issues when running on asphalt. And so because of that, as a result of that, I usually recommend that you start on a softer surface first. Think about that as just giving you a little extra wiggle room to get your form down better, to progress at an appropriate rate, to get your body used to it, and also get those shoes broken in. So typically, I recommend that if you're just starting out, to either go to like a track, because usually tracks made for running are going to be a little softer. They're going to have more give. You can run on like an open field as long as it's fairly flat. The grass isn't too tall so you can see where you're stepping. But I typically recommend to avoid asphalt at first. If you do decide to run on asphalt, again, progress very slowly and focus on your form and make sure you got good shoes. Okay. So by and large, again, I usually recommend starting on a softer surface at first. Really, if you've been running for years and years, it's going to be safer for you to run on asphalt than someone who's just starting. All right. So running on asphalt, is it bad for your knees? Actually, no. Myth busted. Our bodies are really great at adapting to things. And even though asphalt is hard and it does create a lot of force on our joints, our body adapts to that as long as we do the things required correctly. We do it correctly with form, good shoes, progress slowly. All right. So question and answer time. We've got about 8 minutes left. I want to spend some time answering questions. So feel free to start typing them in the chat. It can be directly related to this, or it can be a little off the wall. That's fine too, as long as it's fitness related. While you're typing those, I just want to say real quick, I encourage you guys to check out the other things that we do here at the rec, especially fitness services here. We got a ton of stuff, but fitness services wise, we've got group exercise classes, which if you have a membership are free. Personal training, we do one-on-one training. We do semi-private sessions. We do semi-private sessions. So that can be groups of 2 or 3 people. And then we also do Tide Strong programs every semester. And with those programs, we also usually have a non-member option as well. So for example, this coming spring, we're doing a personal trainer certification course. So you can sign up and it's going to prepare you for the personal training exam. And while it does cost to do that program, you also get a discount on the exam itself to make it easier. But we also do other programs like exercise programs. We do a lot of stuff. But anyways, I'll go ahead and start looking at questions, see what we got. I saw someone join late. That's totally fine. We got this recorded, and I know that Miranda and Ashley are pretty good about uploading it. Yeah, we can do that. And we can also, I'll send her the PowerPoint as well in case anyone wants to see that. Kieran asked, that's great. Where can I find the first and second webinars? So I know they're going to be on the website. I'm going to let Miranda or Ashley give you the specifics on that. I forget how to navigate specifically to there, but I know they have a whole library of pretty much every wellness webinar they've done.
Yes, I'm going to drop the link to the archived classes.
I'll let her type that in there for you. Any other questions? Fitness related, what we talked about today? What do we got? If you don't have anything, you're more than welcome to sign off. But I'm going to hang around in case we got any other questions. Want to make sure we address everything. All right, let's see. One person asked, do we have the option of virtual training classes for personal training, or is it in person? So yes, it is in person. And the main reason for that is it's really hard to train someone virtually. I know you see that a lot, but to actually get someone to improve with your form, you really need to be there in person. So I really don't actually recommend virtual training unless you have a good base first. If you're just starting, you really want to meet one-on-one with someone. I know sometimes that can be a little inconvenient. You got to deal with the gym, but it's really the best way to go about it because there's nothing like having someone there in person to help correct your form and get you on the right track. But yeah, right now we only do in-person training. It's a good question. Yes, thank you, Jacqueline. Have a great day. Appreciate you joining in. Thank you, thank you. Any other questions? My contact info is there at the bottom of this slide as well. So maybe if something pops up in your head after this, feel free to reach out to me. Usually after one of these, I get a couple emails and calls, and I'm more than happy to talk about this stuff. Doesn't matter if you're a member at the rec or not. This is just stuff I like doing. So don't feel like you got to be a member to reach out. I just like talking about it. So my number is down there. My email is just cburroughs@ua.edu. Like I said, if you email me, I'm more than happy to reach out. All right. If we don't have any more questions, then we are done for the day. I think this is my last fitness webinar of this semester. I know we're going to have some more stuff coming up next semester. But again, thank you everyone for tuning in. For those of you who came back, thanks for coming back. I'm glad you liked the first couple of ones. And I hope if y'all see any more that I'm doing in the future, then hop back in. More than happy to keep presenting for you guys. Have a great week, great weekend. And also, December starts tomorrow, which by the way is pretty wild to me, but we're almost done with the semester. So if you got a lot going on here, good luck. I know you're going to do great. All right. See you, everyone.